So we're talking a little bit about the bundler. It was mentioned in that previous video on the, I guess, how did we get here and where we are now in JavaScript. So uh, what are the problems? So all those NPM packages lead to too many folders, hundreds, and files, thousands. And that's not being hyperbolic, right? A simple Node.js Express app, easily 149 folders, over 10,000 something files. It's insane in that. Okay, so many of them are not used by your app. That's another problem too. Does your app touch the code in all of those folders and files? No, you might grab a library and use 1% of it in that. So the browser could never get them all. It could never request 1,000 files and actually receive them all. Your app, it would take forever for them to come across, right? It would, in that, it's just not going to work. So the solution is a bundler, right? And so what the bundler does, right, if it's a bad bundler, it'll just take all those 1,000 files and turn it into one file in that. And then the browser has a hope of requesting one file, but it can't request 1,000, okay, in that. I can also make it smaller, aka a less big file, right? And that's the tree shaking concept and that sort of stuff. So maybe I should go back and put tree shaking in here, but that's what tree shaking is. So a good bundler will go through code and shake it. And what it does is says, hey, your code never uses this file. We're not going to put it in the final bundle. That's going to be the app in production. And so it just keeps walking the tree and says, oh, you don't use this one, you don't use this one. So maybe it knocks out like 99% of those files, right? And that. And so not only does it produce one file for the browser typically, it knocks out all the code that you don't actually use, right? Which is fantastic. And that. So you get one much less big, smaller file, that kind of stuff. And a lot of them offer transpiling. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll put in the code to say, hey, check what browser is talking to us, and you might need a slightly different version for Chrome, for Brave, or for Safari, Edge, definitely for IE, that sort of thing, and that's this concept of polyfills. It's called polyfills, but what it means is if a browser doesn't have a feature, like maybe it doesn't have a promise, they'll write like they don't have a fetch, right? So they don't have a fetch based on a promise. They'll add a bunch of JavaScript code that adds that functionality to your browser, right? And that. So all browsers aren't identical. They all have little quirks, and it might be something they can't get rid of. It was done really early. They have so much other stuff built around it, they can't change it, right? That sort of thing. In that. And so is it getting better? Yes, I would say Edge is more standard compliant than IE and things like that. So over time, we might get better and that. But the bundlers do a couple of things, right? One big file. If it's a tree shaker bundler, then that one big file is going to be much smaller. And it'll put in the missing pieces for other browsers. If you're using a feature, like a more modern feature, like await, maybe you're using await, async await, or maybe you're using a fetch, which technically isn't in this version of this browser, and they'll add the code for you, right? And the custom workarounds, aka the polyfill. So definitely click on the link because the name polyfill, like, I mean, if you're a JS person, you start thinking about colors and polygons and filling it in and stuff like that. But what it really is about is that this browser you're talking to doesn't have this feature in the ECMA, version 5 spec. And so, but someone's built a library that will add it to your browser, and they inject that code, and now your browser can do it. So there's Webpack. We're going to talk about some bundlers so you know, okay, when people are saying these terms, these are the bundlers. So Webpack is a very popular one, right? It's one of the originals. It's even used by Vue. So if you do a Vue app, it could be 2 or 3. The final production version is bundled up with Webpack, and that they put it in early, and so to change it, they're like, we got other alligators to wrestle, right? It works. Rollup is another one. It works on ECMAScript modules. So it's the ECMAScript module system, EMS. It's got tree shaking. It's used by Vite. What's interesting is the people who wrote Vue, right? Vue 2, 3, also wrote Vite. in that. But Vite is a development server. It is agnostic. It could care less if you're doing Vue, React, Svelte, or some other framework. And all Evan, you and the gang are trying to do there are trying to make the fastest dev server on the planet and that sort of thing. And if Rollup does a good job, they don't need to reinvent a bundler. They'll just use Rollup. Now, they don't use Rollup when you're actively developing. A lot of that development is done in what's called an unbundled state in that, so it makes changes in hot module replacement a lot easier. And it's not till you make that, okay, you're like, okay, we've tested it, debugged it, it's working, we need a version for production, then they bundle it, right? And if you're using Rollup, it definitely does tree shaking. So make it smaller, make it one file, kind of concept. Parcel is another one. It's used by OpenLayers in that. Do I know anything off the top of my head? I knew something off the top of my head. Maybe I'll add it into the notes later. In that Fusebox, it's a modern one, simple, fast. It supports TypeScript out of the box. In that Browserify, this one, I mean, it's used in that, and so they make front-end development look like Node development, and well, early Node development, because Node now supports the import statement. But Node, lots of Node examples, because import wasn't there when it started, they use require to do what import does. And so what it is that when you're on the front end importing stuff versus on the back end importing stuff, you're not like, it's not, even though you're in like JavaScript, you're not changing the way you have to do the import. So that way, the way you do it on the front end is the same as you do it on the back end, right? And so you don't have to like, okay, wait, I'm in the front end, I gotta do it differently. Oh, wait, now I'm in the back end. Okay, how do you do it again? Okay, it's done this different way. You don't have to do that. Just make it look the same for the developer. Make it easier on the developer, kind of concept. The import statement, right? In that. So module tech in JavaScript, basically. So before we get to the import statement, we should probably talk about immediately invoked function expression in that. So this, in the early days, before we even had CommonJS and require, how does one JavaScript file load another JavaScript file? So what they're trying to do is like, there is no import statement, right? So these things that we do in Java and Python, where we import other modules and stuff, which is so like everyday workflow thing, there wasn't a thing that existed in JavaScript. So people trying to figure out, well, how can I get JavaScript to do this? And so this is one way. In that, so the dead giveaway that you're in this zone is that you'll go, my variable is equal to this function, but then you'll see this extra set of brackets. Now in my other courses, I call it, the lit firecracker versus the unlit firecracker. So not only do you declare a function, you run it immediately, right? So that's the immediately invoked function expression, is that extra set of parentheses on the back there that says, yeah, this function is defined, run it, kind of stuff, like that firecracker. Then came CommonJS, which was synchronous, right? And we saw this require statement in that. And then we saw AMD, which did an asynchronous version. And they use, depends what framework you're in, but this would be like a Dojo that you would see in the 3.x JavaScript framework. You do a define, and then you have an array, and in that array are a list of modules you want to load, and then you have a function list, and usually have a function for each module. In that, it's done asynchronously, so there isn't some big thud as libraries come down, kind of concept, right? Yeah, require Dojo. Okay, yeah, so it's defined, but in the Dojo one, they flip the word define to require, because then it looks like these other ones, and that sort of thing. And then there's require.js, a type of AMD, so it's a type of AMD, right? And it looks like this. So I'm very familiar with this type because Node uses it. And this would be me loading the PG library. So I would do like an npm install PG. It would put a bunch of stuff in my Node modules folder. And then I go in my Node code, hey, my var PG is equal to require this PG. It's how you basically do an import. And then I would have all the PG code, and I could connect to a Postgres database, username, password, host, port kind of concept, do some queries, get some rows back, send those rows off to the browser. And because you're in Node, when you get the rows, they're JSON, and when you send them to the browser, they're JSON kind of concept. because it's all JavaScript. And so this was the evolution. But the reason they're doing this is because the import statement it's not there. So they had to, rig up something that would make it happen, right? Suck in this other JavaScript file into this other JavaScript file. So they're trying to, do an import without it officially being supported in the language. And so there was all these different attempts. AMD, because it's asynchronous, is an improvement on CommonJS. Require.js is a type of AMD, but it got popular because of Node. That's where Browserify comes in. Make the front end imports look like the back end imports, and then you're, a developer is in happy land if they're crossed between front and back, and that kind of stuff. And then finally, the ECMAScript module system, EMS, has this official import statement. Now the spec can do it, and you gotta wait for every browser to implement it. But today, we are in a place where all the browsers that are being used understand what the import keyword is and what they're supposed to do. And they do load it asynchronously in that, but it's built into the browsers now. There is an official word, but this is the thing. We have all these libraries on the Node Package Manager site that are in these other formats, right? So are we really going to rewrite all that code? Make another library? That kind of stuff. And so that could be why it didn't take off immediately, but it definitely took off in 2019, 2020. No, 2000. No, going back too far. No, it would have been. It's about a year old, right? So it'd be 2021. That's when Snowpack feet kind of dropped in the industry, and they've been getting more and more popular ever since. Developers like speed, that write, test, debug cycle. You want that fast, and that's what those dev servers do with these EMS, because they let the browser do the work of doing the imports, not all these different JavaScript libraries that try to add imports to the language. So I guess we should talk a little bit about ESBuild, right? So what is ESBuild? Hey, it's a bundler, right? In that, so we bundle to develop in an unbundled state, if that makes any sense. So it's extreme speed without needing to cache. ECMAScript 6. That is the, I guess, import keyword. This is what it's about. And CommonJS modules, it can actually convert them on the fly, which that's the goal. So I have this library in this other format, but you can flip it on the fly for me, and then we can develop unbundled, and then Rollup can just bundle it all in this new format. So you kind of like translate your library on the fly. Okay, and that it's got tree shaking of the ES6. That's the EMS ECMAScript module system, but this is about this new word import that came in at this standard of the spec. Okay. There's an API for JavaScript and Go, so it's written in Go, so it's really fast. I believe that might be C. Go might be C++ or a close language, a compiled language that's really fast. We'll have to look it up. Does TypeScript and JSX syntax. The JSX syntax is like a React thing, and that it automatically generates the source maps, helps you debug code in the browser, so it does a lot of work, right? In that, and so but the goal would be taking existing libraries in NPM and flipping them into modern module syntax that the browser can then load with the import command. That's how it's being leveraged in Vite and that. And so, I mean, it's a big help. And the thing is, like, as you bring the libraries down with NPM, then ESBuild can, on a run, do the translation, but it only has to convert the library once in the beginning. So the more you use your development server, because it's already translated the files, then it'll be, it'll just, as strange as it may sound, it's getting faster and faster and that sort of stuff. Also does minification. That's where you get one big long JavaScript with no white space in that. And it shrinks the file in that, so it's a smaller file coming. So it does a whole bunch of stuff. which really helps out a front-end developer. It's also got plugins in case they're missing something and you want to add it. So this is where Vite and Snowpack come in, right? So what are they? They are development servers, okay? So they are like a souped up on steroids HTTP server that I demoed before in the past, okay? They're node-based, like you're in Node, you do npm to install them in that. But their development servers it's to give you a server so that you can run your code against it in that. So it's usually typically for front-end development, right? So the concept would be you already have your data loaded into web services. Like if you're a JS person, I already have my data in web services. If I'm getting chart data, it's coming from something that spits out JSON in that. And so I don't need to build a backend. I don't need to build middleware. The data is kind of ready to go and I can just hit it. And so then I can bring it into the front end and build a dashboard, have data flowing into charts and maps and that kind of concept. It assumes the ECMA module system, ECMAScript, so that ECMA6 import keyword, it's expecting your modules to be in that format. And so Vite uses ESBuild to flip everything into that format for you. However, right? So, but it depends which. I'm not. I know Vite does this. I haven't torn it back. I haven't torn apart Snowpack to see are they really using ESBuild or are they using something else in that. But if your module is in this format, it doesn't have to touch it. Otherwise, it'll call ESBuild to convert it on the fly for you. Hot module replacement. So as you write in VS Code and it gets saved to disk, it will see what parts of the browser need to be updated. So you don't hit the refresh button in that to reload your page. They swap it out for you, right? So if you type really slow, you can see the letters appearing in the browser, in that, right? They usually do some type of bundling for production. Like Vite, like I said, uses Rollup to tree shake and bundle for production. So while you're actively doing that write, test, debug cycle really fast, eventually you'll go, okay, no, it's ready, it's done. Wrap it up for production or roll it up for production. In that. So I know for sure Vite uses Rollup because I have seen I've seen it run or called. I haven't seen, the only place I've seen errors on is ESBuild across a network drive. Works fine on local and stuff like that. Tree shaking, that's what you want. So you want one file but really tiny, and that'll load super fast in the browser. It'll load super fast on your phone when you're on a cellular data connection too, because there's less bytes coming. So we'll talk a little bit about Web Modern Development, WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction. So Web Modern Development, it's just a play on words there for fun. Should probably be Modern Web Development, but WMD sounds much better. So it looks different if you are an HTML CSS person. It looks really different. It can be shocking how different it looks. So some of the samples, a good one would have been where we got the CSV file and parsed it and displayed that in the browser. That is all done like in an HTML file. It is, honestly horrible looking, right? Because you have all this JavaScript code. But there's a flip now. So in that, so it looks different if you're really a hardcore HTML, CSS. JavaScript scares me. Not too bad if you're a Node person because you're already used to this world that like you do a Node Express app or a Koi app and you're in there writing JavaScript and stuff. So, hey, no, this looks like Node in that. So most work is done from the JavaScript side. So you don't see too much CSS. You don't see too much HTML every once in a while, depending on the framework you're using, how they do their templating in that. So if they're like Vue, their templating is HTML. I even think Lit, their templating is HTML. So every once in a while, you'd be bombing around in JavaScript. Oop, a little tiny bit of HTML there. I saw a little angle bracket tag, right? But you don't live in that area, right? So it's a complete flip from previous examples where we had this HTML file with a script tag and then a bunch of JavaScript code, right? That's not a bad deviation if you're also teaching PHP like we do in the course, because that's how PHP is set up. But this Web Modern Development, right, looks very different. to a point where you go, I don't think I'm doing web stuff, right? And maybe it's a JavaScript modern development and that. It's a complete flip from previous, which was HTML based, a flip to JavaScript based, right? So like when you make one of these projects, especially if you use one of like built-in command line tools for Vite or Vue, like they'll generate a tiny bit of index.html, but basically you're working in this like index.js or main.js file all the time. So you're in this JavaScript land. And so it can have a very different feel to where you say, that doesn't look like anything we did earlier in the course. Okay. And so I'm not going to tell you any lies on this one. It does look different. But seeing is believing. So demo time indeed. What you can do now is pause this video lecture and watch the demo on WMD. So if you have a question or need to re-examine a topic or need clarification on a term or concept, you can get an answer by posting a note on the discussion boards for this course. That's all for now.